Hello and welcome to FP Live. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. It is Monday, October 7, 2024, a day of collective mourning. 1 year ago, Hamas attacked Israel. Swarming in from Gaza, the group killed more than 1,200 Israeli civilians and soldiers and took more than 250 hostage. It was the worst attack on Israel since its founding. It inflicted an immense trauma and profoundly damaged Israel's sense of security. In response, Israel has spent much of the last year attacking Gaza in an attempt to eliminate Hamas. According to Gaza's health ministry, it has killed more than 41,000 people and wounded nearly 100,000. The architect of the October 7 attack, Yahya Sinwar, is believed to still be alive, likely hidden deep inside a network of tunnels constructed under Gaza. As Israel's attacks continue, Gaza is essentially a death trap, with civilians unable to get out amid rampant disease and a looming famine, an immense trauma once again. There is also a broader regional war underway involving Israel and Iran, as well as Iran's proxies. I mentioned Hamas, but there is also the Houthi rebels in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon. As we speak, Israel is continuing to bomb southern Lebanon as it seeks to degrade Hezbollah's ability to launch attacks on Israel. As you watch us live today, you will see links to a range of essays published in FP. If you're not yet a subscriber, you can become one today. Use the code FP Live for a 50% discount. Well, my guest today is well known to this audience, and we last spoke on this program immediately after October 7 last year. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's had a long career at the State Department and has advised several Republican and Democratic administrations on the Middle East. Aaron, welcome back to FP Live.
Robbie, thanks for having me on this important and very sad day.
Indeed. So, Aaron, on the one hand, today marks a year since Hamas's attack on Israel and the massive trauma of that. On the other hand, it also marks the start of a new trauma for large populations in Gaza and Lebanon, and a long list of crises that have unfolded as part of that. Personally, I've been struck over the last year how it is difficult for so many people to take in all of these traumas and to reflect the pain on each side, to show empathy, to humanize. And to some degree, the mix of protests and memorials around the world right now reflects the spectrum of this reality. So before we really get into specifics, I wanted to give you an opportunity to open with your reflections 1 year on from October 7.
You know, I've tried, and I defaulted almost immediately. I'll never forget I was awoken by CNN on October 7 with news of an event in the Gaza envelope communities in Israel. And I've tried since that moment, to default to the position of analyst. I've also tried to hold in my head and in my heart the sufferings, the pain, and the trauma of October 7 and the Israeli response, Hamas's terror surge on October 7 and the Israeli response. Hold in my head and in my heart to the degree that is humanly possible for someone who is not an Israeli and not a Palestinian. My critics may disagree with that. I don't play an Israeli or Palestinian on TV, but I long ago have tried both working on these issues and now trying to analyze them to understand that people have two choices. You can make a judgment and determine that you're going to root for one side or the other, or you can acknowledge the reality that this conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is Gertz's definition of a tragedy. It's two competing justices, and it will be resolved or will not or won't be resolved based on leaders who are prepared to recognize that each side has mutual needs and requirements which need to be satisfied. I'd also offer my comment, don't shoot me. There is no objectivity on this conflict, in my judgment. We are all sum totals of our experiences, of our backgrounds, of our sensitivities, of our sensibilities, and of our prejudices. What is a prejudice? It's a prejudgment. I would argue to you, and I've tried, the best you can do is make allowances for the prejudgments that you have, set them aside in an effort to try to understand the narratives and the motivations of Palestinians and of Israelis. This, I think, is critically important if we are going to ever have a chance, however distant it may now appear, to resolve and to work toward what I call a conflict ending. I choose my words carefully here. Conflict ending solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Mm. Aaron, that humility you're showing right now is so important, and I think sets the tone for us today here. Many of our subscribers have written in with questions, and one set of questions which kind of shows some of the binary you're describing, and some of the way in which this conflict has divided people, is about the civilian casualties in Gaza. And some are criticizing Hamas's decision to embed within civilian infrastructure and have argued that Yahya Sinwar wants to maximize casualties. Others among our subscribers are wondering why Israel didn't work harder to preserve lives. And I don't want to get into here whether Israel can or should have done more, or whether Hamas intended this civilian death toll, but I just want to hear your take on this gap in perspectives, which really seems to be an uncompromising binary, I think, in terms of how people view the last year, but also in terms of how people view the larger, more historical conflict here.
I mean, I think it mirrors precisely what I was trying to get at. I mean, there is a context, right, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's no question about that. It did not begin on October 7th. But I would argue to you that context in this case is limited in many respects. And I think this gets to the question of why the divide or the acquiescence or the validation of Israeli military tactics is accepted by some and rejected by others. I mean, October 7th was a unique day in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The killing was intimate, it was brutal. In my judgment, I think it was willful and intentional. Hamas sent out to demonstrate that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict could not be kicked to the side by dreams of Israeli-Saudi normalization, and to make Hamas the centerpiece of Palestinian redemption. It was to be the agent of Palestinian redemption. And in part, it was designed that day to inflict as much cruelty and pain on a civilian population as possible, go beyond anything Palestinians had ever done in the 60s and the 70s, or during Palestinian Intifada, either Intifada. And I think this, to me, sometimes is lost. I think that a split screen may have existed for a short while. On one hand, October 7. And the fact that your viewers are interested in this, and that's the first question we asked, suggests to me that the split screen was, in many respects, replaced very quickly by an Israeli response, first by a blockade, in which nothing got into Gaza, then by a set of airstrikes driven, whether the reports turn out to be accurate, largely by artificial intelligence, the so-called Lavender system, which seemed to place a premium on harm rather than on accuracy. And then a ground campaign, which has claimed the lives of, as you mentioned, 41,000. The Palestinian Ministry of Health doesn't distinguish between combatants and non, even if, as the IDF asserts, there are anywhere from 15 to 20,000 Hamas fighters that have been killed. It's a staggering toll. And you run up against the moral and ethical dilemmas of a military in the wake of October 7, a military that has had a reputation based on other militaries' judgment of the way they handle civilian casualties, a military that prosecuted a war which invariably, inexorably, inevitably was going to lead to the kind of death and destruction, the elimination of entire families, and the destruction of Gaza as we've come to know it. So again, I try to the extent that is humanly possible to look at this as an analytical proposition. The degree of difficulty, Hamas's own willfulness and intention of locating civilian structures and civilian populations. Those tunnels were not designed, as Hamas official said at least twice, to provide refuge and sanctuary for Palestinians. They were the key, frankly. The hostages and the tunnels was the key to Sinwar's strategy of playing for time in hopes that somehow the war would end or others would press to end the war. So I've struggled with this. I've substituted other Israeli prime ministers for Benjamin Netanyahu. How would Ben-Gurion have responded to this? How would Rabin have responded to it? And I've come up, frankly, with no clear answers. And frankly, there is no answer, in my judgment, that is going to satisfy both Israelis and Palestinians, given their collective trauma and the fact that both are living with a kind of, at least for now, permanent PTSD. If you are an Israeli 14-year-old in those Gaza and Wolf communities and you survived, and you're a 14-year-old Palestinian in Gaza, you're talking about, forget the physical damage, you're talking about psychological and cognitive damage that will scar you for an entire generation. And this is where the element of time, I think, becomes both an ally and an adversary in how you actually go forward from what we've watched over the course of the last year.
Mm. You've written several essays, Aaron, for FP in the last year, and one of them challenges the conventional wisdom that October 7 changed everything in the Middle East. The case for that conventional wisdom is pretty well known. So, unprecedented attack on Israel, a truly regional war, direct attacks by Israel and Iran against each other, and much else. What is the case against? So, why do you think the new Middle East, however it emerges, is going to look a lot like the old one?
Yeah, I wrote that piece in February of this year with a colleague, Steve Simon. And it riffed off my own personal sort of view of things. I've become less a believer in transformations. We were told COVID would be the most altering event on the planet since the end of the Second World War. It really wasn't. We were told that Russia's invasion of Ukraine would somehow fundamentally reorient international politics. It would never be the same again. I think that's also wrong. October 7 had historic and violent and bloody firsts that goes beyond anything we've experienced. 1,200 Israelis killed. The Israeli response, which went far beyond the Nakba, in which 15,000 Palestinians were killed and 750,000 were uprooted and displaced, or the Naksa, the setback of 1967. You have the beginning phases of the first, what Amos Harel called the first Israel-Iranian war, which in itself is extraordinary. But I think when I look at this corner of the Middle East and I see the three conflicts that continue to persist, however change the balance of power may have been, Israel versus Hamas, Israel versus Hezbollah, Israel and Iran, I think, frankly, that none of the problems in this region pertaining to Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Israel have been resolved. And resolution seems to me to be farther away than ever before. So the question, what has changed? I think much less, frankly, than in terms of transformation, much less than I think people seem to suggest. Certainly, much less for the better, Ravi. I mean, I think we could agree on that. One additional point: every breakthrough in the Arab-Israeli conflict, with the exception of the Abraham Accords, and they belong in a different category. They are what I call out of conflict zone agreements, which is why, frankly, they have produced the successes particularly between the Israelis and the Emiratis. There was no blood here. There was no trauma. There was no killing. Every breakthrough was preceded by terror, insurgency, and war. 73 ultimately laid 73 war ultimately laid the groundwork for two disengagement agreements between Israel and Egypt, which paved the way for Sadat's peace initiative with Israel. 1991, Madrid peace conference was preceded by Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. And the Oslo Accords, which now lie broken, battered, and bloodied in the region, were preceded by the first Intifada and Rabin and Arafat's calculation that, in fact, there was an opening here for at least the beginning of an Israeli-Palestinian process of negotiation. So that's the open question, is whether the traumas that went far beyond any of these will produce the pain. That's clear. But the prospects of gain, because that's when the status quo changes. When pain is married to gain, things change. That's what happened in these breakthroughs, including Israel-Jordan, which was derivative of the Oslo breakthrough. And I wonder, I've got two 40-year-old kids. I cannot tell them never. I think it's morally unconscionable, basically to say that there will never be a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I occupy a tiny space on the planet for a very short period of time. I wouldn't say never, but I think the space for Israelis and Palestinians has narrowed to almost an optical zero now. And the takeaway here is going to be quite clear to me. Israelis and Palestinians are going to say to one another, you know, the problem is not that we don't understand one another. The problem is that we understand one another only too well.